we've got 4 panelists, and I'll introduce them all briefly and then hand over to the first of those, Helene Hammerow, and then all 4 panelists will be able to give their thoughts on their perspectives on the papers they've heard, the issues they raise, and indeed anything else they'd like to say. And then we'll open up to questions from the audience or indeed from panelists who will be able to type in your questions if you haven't already. And Gareth Davies will then chair that. So the panelists we have today who have, again, very kindly agreed to offer their thoughts in this session. The first to speak will be Helene Hammerow. She's Professor of Early Medieval Archaeology, particularly focused on the archaeology of rural communities in northwestern Europe, primarily 400 to 700 AD, particularly interested in women in that period, with a project on feeding Anglo-Saxon England, and of course one of the people who brought, or the main person who brought to publication Mucking, described as the epic of rescue digging. The second panellist is John Blair, Professor of Medieval History and Archaeology and Emeritus Fellow in Modern History at the University of Oxford. His recent a magisterial tome on building Anglo-Saxon England will be familiar to many. He is a wide-ranging expert in history and archaeology, particularly focusing on buildings, the domestic environment, and with an interest recently particularly in settlement planning. Alison Dickins was a senior manager at the Cambridge Archaeological Unit for 27 years and is now director of Granta Heritage. At the Cambridge unit, she was responsible for projects at Northstowe and Trumpington Meadows, which encountered settlement remains of earlier and later medieval date. She's particularly interested in historic buildings, including farmyards and, I note, pubs. Sadly not right at the moment, I guess, but soon. And then finally on our panel is Chris Dyer, Emeritus Professor of Regional and Local History at the University of Leicester, economic and social historian, particularly focused in a hugely wide-ranging career, and of course a former president of the Medieval Settlement Research Group, much focused on the relationship between town and country and on rural settlements. So those are our 4 panelists. So I'll ask the first of those, please, to Helena to switch on your microphone, rather, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Carenza. I mean, my observations come very much from the perspective of a consumer of infrastructure archaeology, if I can put it that way, and of the very rich archaeological data sets that it provides. I think our speakers have all made it very clear that there are huge benefits to be gained by these very large-scale projects, including the very large-scale linear projects. I mean, I'm minded of the A14 work at the moment, which has uncovered some really important medieval settlement material. So the benefits, I think, are fairly obvious. So I suppose I want to say something about some of the challenges and possibly 1 or 2 priorities for future work. I guess the first challenge I would mention, although I think 1 or 2 of the speakers also noted it, is the importance of understanding some of the more ephemeral traces associated with medieval settlement. And I think when you particularly have these linear projects, that can be particularly challenging. So by ephemeral traces, I mean not only some of the very ephemeral buildings that you get, particularly in the earlier medieval period, but also, of course, field systems, bioarchaeological remains, and so on, particularly in areas where we now know, thanks to, for example, work by John and others, that medieval settlements, and particularly early medieval settlements, have a very low archaeological visibility. In fact, frankly, they're almost archaeologically invisible. So picking those up in linear infrastructure projects is particularly challenging, but incredibly important. Secondly, I think there are challenges raised in terms of the consistency of recordings. So from the point of view of public benefit and of researchers who might at some point wander along and want to use this material, what one sometimes finds with these very large-scale projects is inevitably multiple contractors and practices have been involved. Many different specialists are involved, say, just in recording the animal bones, just in recording the plant remains. They may be based physically in different parts of the country. They may rarely see each other. And so it's very difficult and challenging, I think, to achieve the sort of high level of consistency that the people who might eventually want to use these data will need if they want to make meaningful comparisons and draw meaningful conclusions. So I think having consistency at the forefront of our minds is helpful. Another issue that I suppose has become apparent as I've been working on my own this FEEDSAX project, Feeding Anglo-Saxon project, is around radiocarbon dating. And, you know, we know that, especially for the medieval period, there tends to be the assumption that you can just rely on the ceramics or the odd coin and, you know, who really needs radiocarbon dates? And anyway, isn't it so imprecise for these later centuries? And none of that is really true. And in fact, what becomes increasingly clear is that, you know, phases of occupation that may have been dated by ceramics to a 250-year period can actually be refined quite dramatically by targeted radiocarbon dating, and sometimes can be, you know, revealed actually to have only spanned, you know, 50 or 75 years and not 250 years at all. That seems to be a recurring pattern. So kind of baking in radiocarbon dating at the beginning on an appropriate scale for these large projects is really, really important. So I think I'll leave it there. I was asked only to talk for a couple of minutes, and I'll hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Joan.
Okay. Well, extraordinary riches that we've seen, especially, I must say, Ireland, which I thought is completely mind-blowing, the sheer quantity of material one's getting from Ireland. I'm thinking of some of those late 7th and early 8th century English writers who are so chippy and defensive about the Irish. Well, perhaps they had good reason to be from what we've seen. It's so interesting that 700 appears to be the peak, and after that things decline. And I think that makes a lot of sense in other ways. I think that the riches now that we're getting from these large projects enable us perhaps not to answer the major questions, but at least to ask some of the major questions that haven't been asked before. And I'd like to actually pick up Helena's point about ephemeral settlement that's hard to see, because I think there is an increasing puzzle which has been highlighted by what we're seeing today. Because in Ireland, there's a huge quantity of rich material, very important material. It's found everywhere. In parts of eastern England, the same is true, and we didn't hear about the Huntingdon Relief Road, but that's a good example recently of a road that's gone through several really important major Anglo-Saxon sites, and of course you can see them. You've got the ceramics, you've got the post-hole buildings, the post-entrench buildings. There's a sort of comparability, I think, in terms of what's recovered, what's visible between Ireland and that, but then it highlights all the more starkly the paucity of material from Western and Northern Britain. And in the case of Scotland, we heard about the biodegradable materials. We were told it's not the techniques, it's an inherent problem of seeing that kind of settlement. And of course it's true, and the further west and north you go, the more you've got buildings that are earth-walled or have wattle and non-post-hole type construction, which is harder to see. But what's clear from what we saw in the Irish case is that you can see it in Ireland. The Irish settlements are enclosed, which of course does make them much more visible. But I think it's clear that even if they didn't have all those enclosures, there would still be plenty to see. I'm sure there are fewer people in, for example, parts of Western England, but there are people there. And in the early Middle Ages, their settlements are almost invisible. What we just start to see is the odd site that's excavated because there's some other archaeology, and you find some pits which have some bones, no ceramics, but then when the animal bones are dated, they turn out to be early medieval. So you can see there is a settlement there. Take a county like Staffordshire, we've got Catholme, but Catholme's really right on its own. There are plenty of people living in early medieval Staffordshire. We can't see them. I was recently involved in discussions about the line of HS2 there, and I thought, well, really, what we got to suggest they do is to look for settlements we simply can't see. I think that this problem of invisibility in areas where, yes, there probably really is less going on, but that isn't by any means the end of the story, is one of the major issues that the comparative work that we can now do through the infrastructure projects needs to focus on. Because yes, earth wall buildings, water wall buildings, but we can see them in Ireland. Why can we see them so rarely in other places? So I think that's really the question I take from today, and I'll leave it at that point.
Lovely, thank you very much, and thank you both of you for being concise and sticking to the 2 minutes that we cruelly imposed on you. Alison, please.
Hello. I think, as with the others, somewhat blown away by Ireland. Probably the one that I'm the least familiar with, but not just by the quantity of material and data that's been found, but what's been done with it. And that, I think, seems to be quite a critical difference between what's happening in Ireland and what's happening in any of the parts of mainland UK. But thinking more generally, particularly maybe of the linear projects, rather than the large-scale quarrying or the large-scale housing side of infrastructure, is that we have here tremendous potential, but that it's diluted. That potential becomes diluted by other constraints, and largely those constraints are what have been referred to by several of the speakers, is that the routes tend to be going away from where we might expect to find particularly the later medieval information. I had a quick look at the stats for the A14, which has already been mentioned, because these linear projects have been transformative in other periods, but not so much in early and later medieval. So, for example, on the A14, on 26 areas were investigated in the end, 10 Bronze Age sites, 22 Iron Age, 20 Roman, 10 Saxon, and 1 medieval. A cracker of a medieval, but just one. And that was the deserted medieval village at Houghton. So the picture that is growing and expanding for these earlier periods, it's back to John's question. Why is that not happening? Is it the nature of the sites? Is it the nature of the investigation? Is it how we're bringing the data together? There's an answer in there somewhere, but maybe, as John says, we're getting to the point where we can ask the question, maybe not answer it, but at least ask it. But I think it's moving away slightly from settlements, but one other area where we do have capacity, the other thing that's mentioned on the A14, is that almost every site investigated had a degree of medieval agricultural evidence on it, ridge and furrow, remnant ridge and furrow, and that there is a facet of the medieval rural landscape that we're seeing on almost all these sites. How is that being investigated as well? Paleo-environmental, we've heard mention of radiocarbon dating. Is there also opening in there as well as the settlements? Because, of course, these are the context for the settlements. So I think that's broadly my thoughts. And, yeah, blown away by Ireland.
Thank you very much. And finally, please, Chris. I think you're muted, Chris.
Am I muted now?
You're unmuted now, yes.
Right, very good. Well, let me get going. I've got 2 points to make, or two rather complicated points. But the first one is how impressed I was by Richard Newman's emphasis on avoidance. I hadn't really realised that this was really a major part of the planning of these pipelines and motorways and so on, to avoid sites. And what he was really telling us is that quite often that cannot be achieved. And I'm not entirely, although I deplore the destruction of a medieval settlement site, I'm really rather grateful, because I'm doing a piece of synthesis at the moment in which I'm looking at excavated, deserted sites in 3 West Midland counties, and 5 of the 6 sites available to me were excavated because of pipelines and motorways and so on. There's only 1 research excavation in the whole of these 3 counties of the late medieval period. But I just wanted to make the general point that the reason why we cannot predict and we do destroy sites of particularly the later medieval period, is because we still don't know enough about the settlements before we start. We don't actually know the edges of these champion nucleated villages and the motorways and so on, clip those and destroy part of those. And the other thing is we are still incredibly ignorant about the location of the individual settlements, the farms and the hamlets in the areas of dispersed settlement. I mean, that's why, as Richard Newman says, they destroy sites in Essex and Suffolk and so on. And the same, of course, is true in Western England as well. So we really must have a research programme to locate rural dispersed settlements on a systematic basis, not parish by parish, but for whole regions, because we really don't know enough about the location of those settlements, and that therefore prevents us planning and avoiding their destruction. The second point I want to make is, well, I'll say what all the others say. The Irish archaeologists are on a different planet, aren't they? I mean, they're on a different planet. They are, not only have they found an enormous amount, but they have interpreted it in a really very interesting and important way. They've rewritten the history of the second part of the first millennium AD in a most remarkable way, on the basis of a systematic approach to the evidence. It's wonderful. But the point I want to make, which could be applied elsewhere, I mean, we must catch up with that. But one important part of our research must be to look at these sites that we find on these linear projects in context. If you have a 20-mile pipeline, it goes through 20 parishes, townships, manors. You know, there are territories attached to each part of that pipeline. And I know it's going to be a huge research project, but in a project like HS2, for example, there really ought to be research time, research money given to looking at each of those townships, parishes, so that we can see the sites in context. At the moment, we are just seeing them that they're like butterflies pinned on a board, you know, in isolation, unconnected with their original context. And we must establish that context by understanding the territories in which these sites lie. Thank you. I've finished.
Thank you very much for that, all four of you. What we're now going to do with those provocations, perhaps, that we've had from our panelists is open up for wider discussion. So if the four national speakers, please could again switch on microphones and cameras. Gareth Davies has been looking at the questions that have been coming in from listeners. So we now want to throw it open for the last half an hour, the last 25 minutes, then we'll have a quick 5-minute round up just before 1 o'clock to look at general questions. And of course, panelists are very, very welcome to come back on any of those points and to ask questions as well. I will hand over to Gareth to chair this part of the session. Gareth.
Great, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, yeah. I can hear you.
I've got some things coming in. I'll try and sort of go through the speakers in turn, unless some things kind of sort of crop up as we're going. So start with Ireland and Aidan. Stephen Sherlock has asked, are you proposing any additional outputs, you know, sort of for wider knowledge gain, you know, for the public?
Well, that's something that, thanks for the question, that's something that's ingrained in all archaeologists. I think, you know, we've been doing that forever. And I think it's because we know we're publicly funded, both in the universities and also in the state sector. So it's basically what we do. Transport Infrastructure Ireland takes a very forward kind of look at public engagement. So they, for example, many years ran a magazine called Shanda, which was used to communicate their archaeological discoveries to the wider public. They also have a lovely new thing, a series of podcasts. So every scheme monograph and every major archaeological discovery will have a parallel podcast or an audio book. sometimes with a kind of a fictional kind of depiction of what it might have been like to live at particular places. And of course we have an island-wide magazine, Archaeology Ireland, which is our popular magazine for archaeology, which is actually written by archaeologists. So archaeologists sometimes in a kind of in a little bit of in a kind of a cramped kind of archaeological writing style, but often in a good style, and that has a readership of I think it's something like 30,000 people, and probably more beyond that. So archaeology is very much part of our cultural heritage. What we don't have really in Ireland is amateur archaeology. Archaeology in Ireland is intensely professionalised because we're centrally controlled and regulated by the state. So you can't dig an archaeological site in Ireland as an amateur local community group. But that is growing now. You have community archaeology. And of course, in EMAP, in our own project, I didn't have time to go into it, but we ran conferences. I think we gave about 60 to 70 public lectures, all of those kind of things. So it's something we're continually at. We see ourselves as, without being too big about it, storytellers. And our role is really to tell the story of Ireland to everybody who wants to listen.
Great, thank you. Vicky Baseford has asked, and I think it was picked up on in the panel discussion as well, why are early medieval settlement sites in Ireland almost universally enclosed in contrast to England? Is it defensive? Is it cultural?
Wish somebody would tell me. Yeah, we don't know, except it's absolutely clear that that's what they want to do. So one of the ideas that obviously is coming back into the fore now this year, as might be imagined, is the impact of the Justinian plague in the 540s. So we know it comes to Ireland around 544, but we don't have contemporary historical references for them. Our documentary evidence doesn't become contemporary until the 7th century, essentially. So we don't know what the impact was. Now I know that's variable in the sciences. Some people think that the Justinian plague had a major impact, but there's also a kind of a camp that says not so much. It wasn't as bad as was made out. That Procopius and these other ones are basically overemphasizing. But it so happens that in the 560s, latter part of the 6th century, within the confines of what we can do with radiocarbon dating, it starts and it explodes. And it was the first Celtic tiger, because if you had travelled through early medieval Ireland in the late 6th century, you would have seen ring forts being built everywhere. And even today, in parts of Sligo, if you drive along the modern road, there's a ring fort, there's one, there's one, there's one, there's one. You see them as you drive past them. So something striking happened. They went from basically our Iron Age, which is kind of our Dark Ages, to an explosive population growth. So what is actually going on? I think they're kind of social ideological boundaries. They're defining the inhabited space of the Muintir, or the household group, from the Derib Fine, which is the kin group. All land in early medieval Ireland is owned by the kin group. It's not privately owned, it's communally owned, and those farmlands that are in control of families is divided up through partable inheritance. So a boundary around a settlement has the ability to define one particular social group from everybody. And we can see that in early Irish laws as well. There are fines in early Irish law for opening the gate of somebody's ring fort. There are fines for pushing open the door of somebody's house. There are fines for looking in the door of the house, and there are fines for increasing fines for going in the door. So as anachronistic as that might seem, there are concepts of privacy and distinct zones at which you need permission to enter. They're not really defensive in a military sense. The boundaries often just silt up. They get covered in weeds and branches. And even on early medieval royal sites, which are often defined by multiple banks and ditches, multivolation is a sign of high status and sometimes royalty. They seem to be event-based, as it were. So that it's the ability to pull together a group of people to build one of these enclosures is a mark of status. And in actually some of our early medieval ring forts, what you get is suddenly another bank and ditch will be added. And sometimes that bank and ditch is added on the interior, diminishing the size of the enclosure. But it seems to be the banks and ditches are markers of status. So it's earthen architecture, signalling prestige. And in terms of the church, as you all know, you're looking at symbolic boundaries. So you have this concept of sanctus, sanctissima, sanctior, sanctissimus, holy, more holy, holiest. And that the central core enclosure is the zone of sacred activity, the church, the crosses, the saints' shrines, and so on. But an interesting thing happens in the 8th and the 9th century, that the outer enclosures, where the great unwashed can hang out, they start getting infilled, and in a pragmatic way, metalwork and ironwork then extends over those former boundaries, as if the symbolic boundary is no longer needed. Or there's a sufficient scale of economic activity within the monastery that it's just getting in the way, so things like that. I don't know, you always have this kind of concern about Irish exceptionalism, but it just does seem different.
Thank you. I'm going to sort of group a few questions now, just sort of finishing up on Ireland. Mark Gardner has sort of asked, that the early medieval rural archaeology, lots of people have commented, is absolutely sort of fantastic, but the late medieval results may be less sort of impressive. Would you like to sort of comment on this? And I think, touches on the sort of the avoidance thing that, for example, Richard picked up in his paper, and the linear nature of these things. If you want to have a few comments.
Do you want me to talk first, is it? Thank you, Mark. That's a really annoyingly good question. I need to be going through a tunnel here. Okay. We have always been puzzled by the decline of ring forts in the 11th and into the 12th century. And famously, Giraldus Cambrensis, although we don't trust him, does comment on abandoned ring forts in Ireland when he comes. And it does seem to be part of the pattern of settlement activity, that although some medieval Anglo-Norman sites are on top of early medieval native Irish ring forts, by and large, a lot of them wink out, especially in the eastern part of the island. In contrast, in the western part of the island, stone cashels, stone-built ring forts, really kick on in the 13th and the 14th century. And it is an interesting feature of Gaelic Irish society is it's not static, and it's not unaware of what happens in medieval Europe. I mean, they're drinking wine and they're using ceramics, and they're in contact with the medieval fleets off the west coast and so on. But they continue to live much in the same way as they had before, perhaps in these forts, and possibly even organise their societies in the same way. What happens in the east, Mark? And I don't know. I mean, medieval settlements have been found as part of the TII schemes, but certainly we're not, as you know, Mark, we're not looking at the discovery of villages. We're not looking at the discovery of large-scale late medieval rural settlement. Maybe you'd like to comment yourself, Mark, being an expert on it more than me. Okay.
That's great. Thank you. I think we've got quite a lot to get through. So sort of moving on to Scotland, John. A couple of questions sort of come in. Piers Dixon has asked, is the absence of medieval sites successful mitigation? Just wondered if you got some thoughts on, the particularly problematic, some of the sort of, the snapshots provided by the linear sort of infrastructure developments.
I'm not sure it's it's mitigation itself. I think, to be honest, as you can see from what Aidan's talk, what can be done in a country if you put a concerted effort into seeking out and excavating medieval settlement sites. There's not enough people working within medieval settlement studies in Scotland to even get close to generating that kind of result. And I suspect as a form of mitigation. It's not a very successful form of mitigation because in reality, if we don't know it's there, we can't avoid it in the first place. So it only really appears on sites when we're not really expecting it. You know, there are 1 or 2 examples that, and probably I've talked about as well, that where we were expecting some potential, but on lots of occasions, the archaeology appears in the most unlikely of places during the most unlikely of projects. So that's really what I would say about that.
Also, on just as sort of a factual point, there was a question about is the Kintore settlement published?
It is, yes. It's published in Archaeology Reports Online.
Great, thank you. But I don't know if anyone's got anything else for John. Otherwise, we can sort of go. There's a question that's come in for Wales and for Paul, and it's can the unevenness of the medieval settlement sample, as you put it, be improved through the developer-driven system, or is it more through the frameworks of understanding, you know, sort of the synthesis? You mentioned the GIS and the predictive modelling that our insight can improve.
Well, I think the problem is that the developer-driven system or development-driven system, planning-driven system, is designed largely to address planning questions rather than archaeological research questions, and so it's constrained by the need to be reasonable in planning terms, in terms of what you're asking developers to fund. And whilst in a large-scale linear development like HS2 or the A14, which aren't actually done under the planning system, but they have similar constraint models, or even large-scale developments like a supermarket or some substantial residential development, you know, they might be large enough to generate sufficient archaeological work and sufficient rigor of post-excavation and broader research outcomes in their own right. But when you're talking about a series of very small-scale projects, such as I've described, which is the bulk of stuff in Wales, and actually largely in rural parts of England as well, and Scotland, of course, each individual project cannot of itself really do justice to the archaeology because it's answering planning questions. So I think either you have to change the developer-driven system so that, as in France, where you have central regulation, all work is done by the state, and there is a levy on all development that funds that. That would be one outcome, which I suspect wouldn't sit particularly well in the United Kingdom, but it's one way of doing it. The other is to perhaps use a levy in a slightly different way and to develop those syntheses. But I think we all need to be involved in working closely together in developing those syntheses. I think that's it's been slightly over-egged sometimes, this distinction between commercial archaeology and academic archaeology. I don't think there's a real distinction there, but I think the structures within which we operate make it harder to bridge those gaps. So to actually answer the question, not without radical change to the development-driven system, and probably yes through these frameworks of synthesis, but we need public funding for those.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Moving on to England and Richard, a couple of things that have come through from the sort of the panel observations. Just wondered if you had any sort of additional. I think Helena sort of picked up on it about sort of issues with multiple contractors and different data collection methods on schemes or even different schemes. Whether you have sort of any thoughts at all on best ways forward, you know, for consistency.
It's an enormous challenge. If you just take the one project I referred to a number of times, East Anglia 1, that had 11 different contractors on that scheme. And partly because the A14 was ongoing, HS2 was kicking off, even the bigger units couldn't just come and give you the 250, 300 archaeologists that you wanted. So you had to use different contractors. Obviously, having a strong management regime helps where you are imposing a single system of recording, which was done on that project. Although how effective that was, having done the post-excavation assessment, is debatable. There's a lot you can say, there's a lot of documents you can give, but that doesn't actually get people to do what you're asking them to do. So it is an issue. Strong curatorial leads are important as well. And in counties where you have good standards imposed, Cambridgeshire is a particular example where you do. They are clear, they're well documented, and the curatorial service ensures that they're used. The other issue, of course, is that many of these big projects, such as the A14, East Anglia 1, HS2, luckily are in areas where you have strong and well-staffed curatorial services. If you're doing something similar in the northeast or the northwest, God help you. Because the poor curators don't have the resource to go out and monitor these things on a weekly basis. They can't be in meetings on a regular basis. There's usually only one or two of them. So there's a real issue there. And you can't blame them and turn around and say, well, you know, why didn't you impose these things? They couldn't. They agree a written scheme investigation at the outset, and then maybe they visit the site twice, and they'd have no control, and that is a real issue. But as I say, luckily, many of the big schemes that have come up in recent years are in areas where at least we have better curatorial provision. But I think the issue that Helena particularly raised in relation to the early medieval period and sites where they are more difficult to find, they are less visible, is a problem. There's no doubt about it. And particularly on schemes, which there still are some, where essentially you've just got an extended watching brief, and if something turns up, then you can send a team in. I mean, I know of a recent project where, you know, the ground was cleared by a bulldozer. Well, you're not going to find anything ephemeral then. So there are issues.
It's very interesting, and sort of leads on to the sort of the final question really from some of the panel sort of observations is, you know, that is the fact that, you know, both early and later medieval settlements sort of tend to be found in infrastructure projects because they're, you know, they're either all sort of peripheral activity zones or they're settlements that failed or shifted. You know, I think you've said it is quite problematic. But you know, whether you've got any more thoughts, you know, sort of moving forwards, how best we contextualise them.
Yeah, well, one thing I think this is where infrastructure projects are actually doing quite a good thing, accidentally, in that we are looking at those sites that in the past we weren't looking at, because in the champion areas, the central belt, then, sorry, my puppy has just got hold of my headphone cable, they are tending to avoid the sites, and it's in those areas outside the central belt in either the west or the east where we're getting more opportunities to look at sites, particularly later medieval sites. Albeit what Chris said is absolutely right in that we don't know enough even in the central belt about the edges of the settlements, and we don't know enough about the isolated sites within them. But we are getting these opportunities. The big problem that we have is that most of these schemes start off at an assessment stage run by archaeological consultants, not contractors, but by consultants. And often the consultants just don't know enough. They come in with a GCSE level of understanding of the medieval environment, all three field systems and nucleated verges, isn't it? They make these statements that, well, you won't find any medieval stuff. And I say, I'm now working as a curator in an area where that is possibly one of the few areas where that's true. But in the vast majority of England, it isn't true. And therefore you have a problem because the developers are then faced with all these surprises that they have to fit into their scheme. There are time constraints, budget constraints probably not on the larger infrastructure projects. Not really. I mean, they don't like spending money on archaeology, but at the end of the day, it tends to be a fragment of their actual costs. But time constraints are really pressing, a real problem. I mean, with a cable trench, for example, it's not whether or not you're spending an extra 3 weeks on a site. That costs tens of thousands. But if you delay the boat that is bringing in the cable from offshore by 1 day, that's 250,000, $250,000. So lots of surprises. You need to avoid them. And that means we need better assessment. And that goes right to the heart of Chris's point. You have to have people who understand these things and can put them in context, understand it in terms of the medieval landscape and the medieval structure of that landscape, in order for there not to be these surprises and then problems further downstream.
That's brilliant.
Gareth, can I say something very quickly about the Irish context in terms of that, because I found the other presentation to be really interesting. So I think one of the advantages we have in Ireland is that the major infrastructural schemes, which are really the motorways and roadway developments, were managed centrally by the Transport Infrastructure, the National Roads Authority as it was time, and Transport Infrastructure Ireland now has changed its name. And actually what happened was, in a code of practice agreement between the NRA and the National Monument Service, our state regulator, was adopted. And what actually happened in effect was young professional Irish archaeologists were appointed as project archaeologists for the TII. And their role was to maximise efficiencies and benefits to TII in building the roads, to minimise costs and maximise the archaeological benefits. But these were really, really good archaeologists already. These were digging archaeologists that went into these bodies. It isn't different as our roads go across counties. It doesn't change. It's the national infrastructural development programme. So this was managed by archaeologists who basically worked with consultant archaeological companies to make sure that particular standards were kept to. So you have the same standard of archaeology being done in County Leitrim as you would have in County Wexford. It's all the same. And then obviously follows aerial photography, LiDAR, geophysical, centre testing, 100% excavation, all done months before the engineers would be coming in. You didn't get the scenario in Ireland in those years of archaeologists working in front of machines. The archaeological sites were resolved a year, months before any roadways came anywhere near any of these sites. So we did have that advantage in the structure of our organisations.
That's great. Thank you very much. There's loads of stuff we could talk about. I'm conscious that time is moving on, so I'm just going to hand back to Carenza for any sort of summing up or panel stuff.
Okay, thank you very much for handling those questions, Gareth. It's been really interesting to hear how the themes are emerging and the sort of strengths and the weaknesses of the current situation. I'd just like to ask each of the panel members, just before we finally wrap up, and this is partly to tee up the next seminar we want to do in this series, which will be looking at Europe. So I'd like to ask the individual panel members for their thoughts, sort of, what are our priorities perhaps for the future, and how do they think the situations that we've heard today may compare with Europe, and are there any particular areas in Europe they would like to hear from in the next seminar, because we deliberately haven't arranged the speakers for the next seminar until we'd had this one. So we're very keen to hear what your thoughts are on that, and indeed any other final thoughts that you'd like to offer. So Helena, are you happy for me to come to you first on that? We'll go through panelists in the same order as before.
Sure, I'll be very brief and just I think pick up on your point about Europe and the situation there. I mean, the first thing one has to say is, of course, the grass is always greener. And whenever you go to a conference, in the days when one went to conferences in Europe, and you have those conversations in a pub or something, the grass is always greener and everybody complains about their system and so on. Nevertheless, I think it's unarguable that in most European countries, there is more targeted state funding, the purpose of which is to incentivize collaboration between development-led, commercial infrastructure archaeology and, for lack of a better word, academic archaeology. And development-led archaeology is more formally embedded within museums, within university departments. Those links are there and they're formal. And as we know, at least in England, not true in Ireland, perhaps other nations, but certainly in England, those formal links have, to all intents and purposes, been lost. And that creates, I think, a lot of problems and a lot of missed opportunities, and really, ultimately, really limits the public benefit of the archaeology that is being done.
That's really interesting perspective. John, can I come to you next?
Well, I certainly agree with that. And of course, when one looks back, I started in the 70s, it was all based in universities, but of course on a hugely smaller scale. The amount of archaeology that's been done has increased enormously, but it has indeed lost those university links. And I think the kind of thing, for example, Oxford Archaeology has done, got an academic panel, the more that the major units can rebuild these links by bringing in specialists from outside to be involved in discussions. I think that would be very creative. Of course, the other thing, though, is that in continental countries there is less of a community or amateur element, and that is a valuable thing which we have. Of course, one major aspect, not much discussed today, is the question of responsible and controlled metal detecting, which has come to become acceptable here in a way that it still isn't really in most continental countries. That's, I think, a big difference. However, I think I'll have a lot more to say about that after the next conference, obviously. Just one final thought, going back to something that was said early on about what do we need here. Surely one of the major things we need here is much, much more integrated data gathering, storage and retrieval capacity. I mean, I think that all of us know, I certainly know from my settlement project, so much in grey literature. I think things have got better, but there is so much in grey literature, particularly the earlier grey literature, which is extremely difficult to get hold of. And I think back to my own experience where actually my main way of getting hold of a lot of the grey literature reports was from the generating bodies, not from local HERs, which often didn't have them. And that situation is not good. I think quite a lot has been done to remedy it, but we really want to aim at a point where everything that's been done is available on a single integrated database, where that in a particular area or a particular place you can instantly look at what's been done there, which we're not there yet.
Thank you very much. Alison, can I come to you next? You're muted, Alison.
Muted.
No. Yeah, has that got it?
Yeah.
I think I'm particularly interested in hearing both how infrastructure projects, but mass archaeology is handled in the eastern side of Europe. I think particularly that have come out of perhaps different political regimes, and how has their system ended up, and how are infrastructure projects handled? Are they handled inside by the internal archaeologists? Is it people coming in? That's the one question I think that tickles at my mind that I would like to hear about.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And finally, Chris.
Yes, it's difficult on Europe. I just agree with what most people have said. I was very struck by a Dutch archaeologist talking about the Valletta Treaty. And apparently the Valletta Treaty transformed Dutch archaeology and produced a lot more funding for archaeology in advance of building development and so on. I don't think many people in England have heard of the Valletta Treaty. We were a party to it. We signed it. We negotiated it. And it does apparently, in some countries, open the doors. And I'd be interested to know from a Dutch archaeologist what they did to turn Valletta into this revolutionary opportunity. But to be boring about and repetitive, what we all need to aspire to is EMAP. We all need to do something as good as EMAP. and that means, as John says, improving the availability of the data, either electronically or just on paper, to make it available, and to have people asking big questions about these fragments of evidence, because that's what it's all about, isn't it? That we've got lots and lots of fragments of evidence, and we're not trying to make sense of it in a coherent and organised way. And EMAP has obviously done that. So let's all learn that lesson. The letter and EMAP, these are the way forward. Bye.
Brilliant, thank you. So that summed it up in two handy words then, letter, EMAP. To be able to do that out of the huge diversity of papers we've had today, covering such a huge area and necessarily and unavoidably having to skate quite thinly across all of this. It's really inspiring, I think, to think that we actually have a model for something we could work towards. We have a better idea, I think, of where the snag points are and where the gaps are, both in sort of training, knowledge and experience in the processes that govern how these infrastructure project archaeological works are actually planned. We've got some ideas about how this could be done better, perhaps by tying universities better back into the development process, though how you to do that in countries where that link has been, as Helena said, largely broken, is a challenge, but at least we've identified the shape of the challenge, perhaps. And we thought about the questions of making information more easily accessible for anyone who is trying to bring that together. And of course, we're in an era when we have GIS and we have AI, we have computers, as it were, that can help make that information available and indeed process it, because the first thing, of course, we will discover when we start to try and do an EMAP for the whole of the UK, let alone the whole of Europe, and even if we think more widely about Europe as and medieval Europe as extending into sort of Western Asia, Northern Africa, you know, it's a huge, there's such a huge amount of data. But perhaps there are big data methods within AI and GIS that can help with that. But ultimately, we're always going to be relying back down on the ground on those tiny fragmentary, ephemeral pieces of evidence that we've highlighted today as being so important. So thank you very, very much to all of you, speakers and panelists, and people who supplied questions, and those of you who've listened and thought today. It's been a really illuminating morning, and I think actually much more inspiring than perhaps some of us might have feared that it might have been. Because I think we do have a sense of potential, we have a sense of progress made, and we have a sense of the promised land where perhaps we'd like to get to. So I do hope you'll all be able to join us for the second seminar in the autumn, and when we will pick that up again and look at this in its wider perspective. So thank you very, very much, all of you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend and look forward to a good summer. Thank you.